Hello and welcome to NewsClick. We are going to be discussing the recent German elections and its outcome. In the popular press, the impression going around is that this has been a decisive victory for Angela Merkel and the CDU. Sure, the election results have gone along the lines predicted by pre-election polls, but perhaps such a simplistic interpretation of the German elections is not correct. To discuss these issues, we have with us today Dr. Anil Bhatti, Professor of German Studies, formerly of the Jawaharlal Nehru University. In my introduction, I spoke of this election not perhaps correctly being interpreted as a victory for the CDU. We know that the CDU has perhaps got the lowest poll percentage in the last almost 4 to 5 decades. The Social Democratic Party, of course, has lost heavily. But I think the implications of this for the CDU certainly are not as rosy as the picture being made out.
Yes, you're quite right. This election is significant because the grand coalition of the CDU, CSU and the SPD, as taken as a whole, has lost heavily in the election figures, and significantly the Greens and the Free Democrats have got a very respectable percentage of the votes. The Free Democrat, in fact, have got the highest percentage they ever had in their history, and that is how they will be able to form a coalition with the CDU and the CSU. But perhaps the one real major factor in this elections has been the startling success of the left, the so-called the Die Linke, as they call themselves, who suddenly have reached 11%. So what we have is, on the one hand, as you said, the decline in the voting figures achieved by the classical large parties, the CDU, CSU and the SPD, and the significant votes achieved by the smaller parties like the Free Democrats, the Greens and the left. The low figures for the big parties, CDU, CSU and SPD, are certainly something which have to be analyzed very carefully, because this marks a departure from the classical figure of the state in Germany being, as it were, a state divided up between the two camps.
Largely a two-party.
Largely a two-camp party, one's middle and right, one middle and left.
Right.
And the other parties were supposed to be more or less marginal. But this has changed now. I think it is again going to be a very strongly a coalition-oriented phase in German politics, and it is a phase which is going to be determined by some key aspects of our present international and national situation, being a part of the opposition to be played by the left and the Greens, and perhaps some other.
Right. So I'd like to look a little more closely at some of the features of what you spoke of. First, looking at the Free Democrats, they are the big gainers.
They are the big gainers
in this election, and I may not be incorrect in saying that the Free Democrats, in some sense, at least in economic policy, are perhaps even to the right of the CDU in terms of market economics and neoliberal policies. And would it be right to interpret these results as not only a disillusionment with the Grand Coalition, but also a move towards a more free market economy? Whether that was the voters' intention or not, that's perhaps what we are likely to see.
Well, that certainly is one part of it, but the FDP has gained for having positioned itself very intelligently in this electoral campaign. For one thing, certainly the neoliberal policies which everybody knew about, they have strictly maintained this position of a market-oriented policy, and they have also, as is quite normal for a neoliberal party, asked for lower taxation.
Right.
Lower taxation. But they have also occupied certain themes which are usually classical liberal themes, such as, for instance, opposition to censorship.
Right.
Internet censorship. That is a very important factor in the mind of, shall we say, particularly young people. at the same time also they have made statements in favor of larger investment in education.
Right.
Of course, nobody is quite taken in by that commitment to education, because it is also
Sure.
a commitment which goes across the
But
thing.
the Free Democrats have always been, shall we say, economically on the right, but socially more towards the center. They've
Socially
always-
more towards them, and also very strongly oriented towards the
towards the
individual
individual freedoms. and
individual
so on.
freedom. The weakness of their position comes out in analysis, not only the neoliberal market orientation, but also their stand on health.
Then coming to the other small parties, which is the left mainly, you've pointed to the rise of the left, which is a new configuration, Die Linke as we know it today. It's not the traditional communist PDS that we knew of earlier. It also has splinter groups from the SPD, Oscar Lafontaine and others. Has the left fared better across Germany, or is this confined to some pockets?
See, traditionally, you're quite right. It is a coming together. The left is a coming together of various strands of what you might call left positions in Germany. It has fared traditionally, or at least in the last, since the German unification, the left in the form of the PDS was supposed to be an East German phenomena. Right. What is significant in this election is that it is now a all pan-Germanic party. It has got above 5% in all the states of the German Union. And that, I think, is the real test of a national party. It has its major strengths still in the east, in the eastern part of, that is the former GDR, in the eastern part of Germany. But as I said, it has got substantial amount of above 5% in all the other states too. Now this is the real...
And how do you read the decline of the Social Democrats in voting terms, and particularly while it appears clearly as a serious drop, and it has been taken as such by the leadership of the SPD, but Germany being a federal polity, the SPD still retains a strong base in many of the states, and is therefore it's not easy to sort of write off the SPD as if it's...
No, by no means. The SPD cannot be written off by no means, and many of its major historians or even great politicians in the Brandt and Wehner era have always maintained that the SPD, it's sometimes good for the SPD to be in the opposition for some time to rejuvenate itself, and I think there are already signs that it will do so. See, the SPD suffered from 2 or maybe 3 major drawbacks. As part of the Grand Coalition, it was also a party which was responsible for the economic situation, for the international foreign situation, and so on and so forth. And it has not been able to dissociate itself and develop a profile which would address itself to the problems of German society today in terms of labor, in terms of education, in terms of social reforms, in terms of health reforms, and also foreign policy.
Right.
Now these positions have been taken over much more by the left, by the Linke, let's call it the Linke, by the Linke, by the Greens, and to some extent also by the FDP. As you also pointed out, classical themes have been taken over the FDP. But mainly, for instance, the left was, as far as I can see, one of the few parties, or probably the only party, which insisted on the Afghanistan issue being taken up, and that the SPD had compromised itself. In contrast to its history, with Schroeder and others, you know, opposition to the Iraq war and all that had been a very popular issue. So the SPD, in a sense, was sucked into the coalition politics and became more or less indistinguishable from the CDU or not.
In fact, perhaps both the CDU and the SPD tended to lose out from the Grand Coalition because they both had to move away from their traditional positions far closer to the center than they would have otherwise.
All coalition politics is like that.
Exactly.
But the SPD suffered much more because it was unable to project itself in the classical heritage of a party of social democracy.
So in this pattern of the major parties moving towards the center, leaving a bit of vacuum on the fringes, which is now getting strengthened with the Greens, with Die Linke, and others. And if I'm not mistaken, the far right has also done not too badly, although they haven't made enough of a mark.
Well, one of the good things about this election is that the far right has not crossed the 5% mark, but they
Right.
still have a considerable potential, especially in the East, for various historical reasons. They are represented in at least 4 state parliaments in East Germany. So one cannot simply ignore the right wing. It may surface over time, and certainly they have a tremendous amount of destructive potential, irrespective of whether they are in parliament or outside parliament, as many people, especially foreigners, have learned to their.
Right. So from the relative dullness of the Grand Coalition, interesting times ahead in Germany?
There are interesting times ahead in Germany, as you said, in domestic policy. Foreign policy is very important. You mentioned, I think, the Afghanistan issue will now be a major source of conflict between the government, which will support it, and the opposition, which will once again try and resurrect that Schröderian era of remaining, of not interfering with arms, and or at least not having a military presence in the crisis regions of this earth. That will, I think, be the major problem.
Thank you very much.